You know you've made a bad decision when your plan depends on a quick trip to Russia because, spoiler alert, no one in history has ever gone to Russia in the winter and come back saying, that went better than expected. But somehow, two of the most ambitious men to ever walk the earth, Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler, looked at that same icy map and said, yeah, we can handle it. 2 centuries apart, same continent, same overconfident, and almost word for word, the same catastrophic mistake. So today, we're not just looking at what happened, we're diving into why both Napoleon and Hitler made the exact same disastrous choice, even with history screaming, don't do it. Let's rewind to Europe. Early 19th century. Napoleon Bonaparte, France's unstoppable military genius, is running out of people to conquer. By 1812, he's basically won everything west of Poland. His armies have turned Europe into a French theme park, complete with customized laws, puppet camp, and that smug sense of destiny only a man in a big hat can have. But there's one problem: Russia. Tsar Alexander I, the charmingly unpredictable ruler of the East, was supposed to be Napoleon's ally. They'd shaken hands, traded compliments, and divided Europe like a couple of overconfident real estate agents. But alliances in the 1800s had the shelf life of a ripe banana. Soon enough, Alexander decided he didn't like playing second fiddle to France or paying for Napoleon's continental trade embargo in Britain. So he quietly reopened trade with London. Napoleon, ever the control freak, saw this as betrayal. And if there's one thing history tells us about Napoleon, it's that he does not take betrayal well. Now, from a strategic point of view, Napoleon didn't need to invade Russia. France was at its peak, his empire enormous, and his enemies mostly crushed. But from Napoleon's point of view, the logic was simple. Russia had to be punished, decisively and dramatically, to remind everyone who was in charge. Because when you've conquered most of Europe, what's one more massive, freezing, logistically impossible campaign? Here's where the absurdity starts to snowball. Napoleon convinced himself and his generals that this would be quick. A swift march to Moscow, a symbolic victory, and boom, Tsar Alexander would crawl back to the negotiation table. It's the military version of, I'll just stop by for it. Except instead of running errands, Napoleon brought 600,000 soldiers. The Grande Armée, as it was proudly called, wasn't just French, it was a pan-European mashup of troops from across Napoleon's empire. Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch. Basically, everyone who owed France a favor or didn't want to be invaded next. Now, if this sounds familiar, that's because it's almost exactly what Hitler would think 129 years later. A lightning-fast invasion, easy victory, and home in time for the holiday. But we'll get to him later. For now, picture the scene. It's June 1812. The fields are green, the weather's warm, the soldiers are optimistic, and the French supply wagons are packed with more champagne than common sense. Napoleon himself was confident, famously telling his officers that the campaign would take only a few weeks. And technically, he wasn't wrong. It did take only to realize it was a terrible idea. The moment Napoleon's army crossed into Russian territory, everything started to unravel. The Russian strategy wasn't to fight, they just ran away. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. Tsar Alexander's generals had studied the French playbook and decided, you know what? Let's not play. They called it the scorched earth strategy. Every time they retreated, they burned villages, destroyed crops, and took livestock. So while Napoleon's army marched forward expecting food and shelter, they found ashes. It's like planning a road trip where every gas station ahead has mysteriously vanished. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Supplies dwindled, horses died, soldiers starved, and the Russian army just kept retreating, taunting them without firing a shot. But Napoleon couldn't turn back. Not yet. He'd come too far, spent too much, and his ego was already halfway to Moscow. He needed a victory, something to justify this colossal gamble. And in September, he finally got it. The Battle of Borodino, one of the bloodiest single-day battles of the Napoleonic Wars. It technically counted as a French victory, but at such a cost that even Napoleon looked shaken. He won the field, but lost the war of attrition. Still, Moscow was ahead. And Napoleon believed, truly believed, that once he took the Russian capital, the Tsar would surrender. On September 14, 1812, Napoleon finally entered Moscow. But instead of cheers and parades, he found silence. The city was empty. The people had fled. And then, as if on cue, the city caught fire. Not from bombs or artillery, from the Russians themselves. They'd burned their own capital rather than let Napoleon have it. Imagine conquering the prize you've spent months chasing. only for it to literally set itself on fire in front of you. Napoleon waited 5 weeks for Tsar Alexander to surrender. The Tsar didn't even reply. Winter was coming, supplies were gone, morale was collapsing, and the world's greatest army was trapped in a city of ashes. So Napoleon did the unthinkable. He ordered a retreat. What followed was not a retreat so much as a slow-motion collapse. Blizzards, starvation, frostbite, nature itself became the enemy. By the time the remnants of the Grande Army staggered back to Poland, only about 10% were still alive. Napoleon had started with 600,000 men. He lost over 500,000 without ever forcing Russia to surrender. His empire would never recover. And here's the thing. The story should have ended there, because no one, absolutely no one, could look at Napoleon's campaign and think, let's try that again. But fast forward to 1941, and a certain German dictator looked at that same map, that same border, and thought, hold my beer, it's 1941. Europe, once again, is under the control of one man who believes he's unstoppable. And once again, that man is about to discover what happens when you underestimate Russia and overestimate yourself. Because, apparently, Napoleon's disastrous 1812 invasion wasn't enough of a warning. A century later, Adolf Hitler looked at the same frozen wasteland, the same supply problems, and thought, you know what the issue was? Napoleon just didn't have enough trucks. Yes, this is the story of Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, and the sequel no one asked for. By mid-1941, Hitler's Germany was on top of the world. In less than 2 years, his armies had steamrolled through Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and half of Europe. To many, it looked like the man couldn't lose. His soldiers were disciplined, his tanks modern, and his propaganda machine very loud about both. Britain was holding out, but barely. And for Hitler, the next logical move wasn't peace or consolidation. No, it was more expansion. He wanted Lebensraum, living space, and where better to find it than the endless plains of the Soviet Union. There was just one tiny problem. He'd already signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin in 1939. That agreement had allowed him to invade Poland without worrying about the USSR. It was a cynical marriage of convenience. Two dictators, smiling for the cameras while planning to stab each other in the back. By 1941, Hitler decided it was time to do the stabbing. And he wasn't shy about it. He told his generals the war against the Soviet Union would be quick, a blitzkrieg, lightning fast. In his mind, the Red Army would collapse like France had. The campaign would last a few months at most. Sound familiar? Hitler's invasion plan, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, was launched on June 22, 1941, almost exactly 129 years after Napoleon crossed into Russia. 3 million Axis soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 600,000 horses, and enough optimism to melt Siberia. The idea was simple: hit fast, hit hard, and destroy the Soviet Union before winter. The German army split into 3 massive groups. One heading north to Leningrad, one south to Ukraine, and one straight for Moscow. If all went well, it would be over by October. And at first, it worked terrifyingly well. The Wehrmacht tore through Soviet defenses, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners in the first weeks. Soviet troops were poorly equipped, communication was chaos, and Stalin himself seemed paralyzed by disbelief. The German generals were ecstatic, the press declared victory inevitable, and Hitler, never one for humility, began designing his post-war borders before the war was even halfway done. It was, in short, the exact same overconfidence Napoleon had, only now powered by gasoline ideology. But remember that little historical proverb, never invade Russia in the winter? Well, Hitler apparently didn't. By late summer, German forces were still hundreds of miles from their main objectives. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Railroads used a different gauge, meaning every shipment had to be unloaded and reloaded by hand. Fuel shortages, broken vehicles, and worn-out soldiers began to slow the advance. And yet, Hitler refused to adjust. He kept diverting troops to chase symbolic victory, first toward Ukraine for resources, then toward Leningrad for prestige. Each delay gave the Soviets time to regroup, mobilize, and, crucially, prepare for winter. By October, the weather turned. Roads turned to mud, so deep that trucks sank up to their axles. The German advance slowed to a crawl. And then came November. Temperatures plummeted. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever rags they could find, because the German High Command, in its infinite wisdom, hadn't bothered to issue proper winter uniform. After all, The war was supposed to be over by then. Napoleon would have sighed in recognition. In early December 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. They could see the spires of the city in the distance. Victory seemed just a few miles away, but it might as well have been another continent. The Soviet resistance, fueled by desperation and sheer cold, fought back fiercely. Reinforcements from Siberia, troops who actually knew how to survive winter, arrived with new tanks and supplies. And then, on December 5th, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. The Germans, exhausted and freezing, were pushed back. And in that moment, Operation Barbarossa and the myth of the invincible German army began to collapse. Just like Napoleon, Hitler refused to retreat. He forbade withdrawals, ignored reality, and replaced generals who disagreed with him. It wasn't strategy, it was denial on an industrial scale. By the time winter ended, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were dead or captured. The Eastern Front had turned into a meat grinder that would consume millions more over the next 4 years. The quick, decisive war Hitler promised became a nightmare of attrition, the same one that had destroyed Napoleon's empire. There's something tragically poetic and darkly funny about this parallel. Both Napoleon and Hitler thought they were rewriting history. Both believed they were unstoppable, and both ended up being defeated not by brilliant generals or clever politics, but by geography, logistics, and the Russian winter. It's as if Russia itself said, "Oh, you brought an army? That's adorable." Napoleon's failure marked the beginning of his downfall. Hitler's invasion did the same, shifting momentum toward the Allies and ensuring Germany could never recover from the two-front war it had created. History didn't just repeat itself. It copied and pasted, with minor updates in technology and a bigger body count. So what is it about power that makes people forget how maps work? Why do conquerors look at the vast frozen expanse of Russia and think, this time will be different? Maybe it's arrogance. Maybe it's delusion. Or maybe, deep down, every empire thinks it's immune to the rules of reality until winter reminds them otherwise. And that brings us to our final act, not the invasions themselves, but what came after. How two men's obsession with control unraveled their empire, and what the world learned or didn't learn from their colossal mistakes. By the time Napoleon limped back from Russia in 1812, Europe had stopped fearing him and started watching the clock. His once mighty empire was cracking, and the rest of the continent could smell blood. The invincible French emperor had been defeated not by another man, but by his own ambition and a weather forecast he refused to check. His allies turned against him. Armies that once marched under his banners switched sides. Within 2 years, the same generals who toasted his victories were negotiating his exile. The map of Europe, which he'd redrawn in his image, began to fold itself back into chaos. And as for Napoleon himself, he tried to make a comeback, of course. Because what's one disastrous defeat compared to the power of denial? But even his famous return, the 100 Days, couldn't save him from the consequences of that one frozen march. Russia had been his breaking point. His Waterloo was just the paperwork. Fast forward 130 years, and you can almost hear history loading the same file again. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was supposed to secure his empire for 1,000 years. Instead, it barely lasted 4 more. The failure of Operation Barbarossa didn't just stall Germany's war effort, it doomed it. The Wehrmacht lost its aura of invincibility, and the Soviet Union transformed from victim to vengeance. The Red Army pushed back with fury, and the Eastern Front became a black hole that swallowed German manpower, resources, and morale. Hitler, much like Napoleon, refused to face the truth. He blamed his generals, his allies, the weather, anyone and anything but himself. Sound familiar? The same pride that had driven him to invade Russia now kept him trapped in delusion. He dug in deeper, convinced that sheer willpower could change physics, logistics, and temperature. It couldn't. By 1945, Berlin looked eerily similar to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, burned, broken, and buried under the weight of its own ambition. 2 empires, 2 centuries apart, both destroyed by the same fatal cocktail of arrogance, impatience, and the inability to admit a mistake. But let's be fair. It's not that these men didn't know about the risks. Napoleon had maps, reports, and advisors begging him to reconsider. Hitler had entire libraries of military history, including Napoleon's failed campaign right there for reference. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was ego. Both men believed history didn't apply to them. That's the real punchline. They didn't just ignore the lessons of the past, they actively believed they were the exception to them. Napoleon thought his genius could outthink nature. Hitler thought his ideology could outlast it, and both discovered the same universal truth: the universe doesn't care how special you think you are. Now here's the part most people forget. These weren't just military blunders. They were psychological collapses disguised as wars. Napoleon's invasion was the turning point where the myth of his invincibility cracked. His retreat wasn't just a military defeat. It was the moment the illusion of destiny broke. He went from emperor of Europe to guy stranded in the snow. For Hitler, Barbarossa was the same kind of breaking. Before 1941, everything he touched turned to victory. After Russia, everything turned to rubble. His grand empire became a desperate scramble for survival. And the irony? Both men ended up isolated, paranoid, and surrounded by yes-men repeating what they wanted to hear. If this sounds like a pattern, that's because it is. History isn't just a series of dates and battles. It's a highlight reel of human overconfidence. Every empire that falls does so with someone, somewhere, saying, "We've got this." Napoleon's frozen march exposed the limits of 19th century logistics. Hitler's invasion exposed the limits of 20th century ideology. And both left behind the same cold lesson: no amount of power can outsmart geography. You can almost imagine a cosmic narrator shaking his head every time a new leader points east and says, "It'll be quick." Because if there's one consistent character in the story of human arrogance, it's Russia's winter. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't negotiate. It just waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't matter whether you're a French emperor in 1812 or a German dictator in 1941, your tanks, your horses, your dreams of conquest all freeze the same. There's a moment, often overlooked, when Napoleon reached the Berezina River during his retreat. The bridge collapsed under the weight of panicked soldiers. Thousands died trying to cross the icy water while Napoleon stood on the bank silent. For the first time in years, the man who always had an answer had none. More than a century later, Hitler found himself trapped in a bunker, hearing the Soviet artillery echoing outside Berlin. Like Napoleon, he too was surrounded by ruins of his own making. Different era, same silence. So what did the world learn from all? Well, that depends on how optimistic you are. On one hand, these stories remind us that even the most powerful figures can be brought down by a combination of bad judgment and cold weather. On the other hand, human arrogance seems to have a short memory. We still repeat mistakes, just with better technology and worse excuses. But there's something strangely comforting about that, isn't there? That history, for all its tragedy, still manages to rhyme with a sense of cosmic irony. That two of the greatest conquerors in history were undone, not by superior armies, but by their own refusal to believe that the rules applied to them. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not about war, or politics, or strategy, but about the danger of thinking you're untouchable. Because whether you're leading an army or just trying to prove you're right, the moment you start believing you can't fail, you're already halfway to Moscow. You'd think, after two world-class disasters, humanity would have learned a simple lesson: don't pick a fight with Russia in winter. It's right up there with don't microwave metal and never read the comments section. But history isn't great at learning from itself, it's great at rebranding the same mistakes. Napoleon's invasion was called the Russian Camp. Hitler's was Operation Barbarossa. Both sound bold, strategic, even cinematic, right up until the part where everyone freezes and starves. The real irony? Both men thought they were making a statement. Napoleon wanted to prove he was untouchable. Hitler wanted to prove he was unstoppable. And both ended up proving that no one, no matter how brilliant, how ruthless, or how convinced of destiny, can win an argument with the weather. It's almost poetic how identical their reasoning. Napoleon told his generals, "One good battle and Russia will bow." Hitler told his, "A few months and the Soviet Union will collapse." They both believed victory was inevitable, and both were technically right. Just not for them. And maybe that's why these stories still fascinate us. Because deep down, they're not just about war, they're about ego. About the human tendency to think, this time, I'll be different. It's the same logic that makes people text while driving or invest in crypto, because it can't crash again. The costumes change, but the confidence is the same. Both invasions began with grand speeches and perfect maps, beautiful lines drawn across paper, as if geography cared about your ambitions. But when the snows came, all that strategy melted faster than Napoleon's army wrap. And what's left, after the smoke and the snow settle, is a kind of tragic comedy. Two men who wanted to control the world, brought down by mud, frostbite, and the logistical equivalent of didn't pack enough socks. In the end, the Russian winter didn't just freeze armies, it froze empires. Napoleon's fall reshaped 19th century Europe, ending French domination and ushering in a new balance of power. Hitler's defeat in the East turned the tide of World War II, leading directly to Germany's collapse and the birth of the Cold War. Both invasions didn't just fail, they reset the world. There's a theory some historians like to joke about: the Winter Clause. It's the unspoken law of history that says, if you think you can conquer Russia, you automatically can't. It's the universe's way of enforcing humility. And if you zoom out far enough, you can see the same rhythm repeating everywhere: hubris, overreach, downfall. From emperors to CEOs, from conquerors to anyone who ever said, "Trust me, I've got a plan." It's the oldest story in the book, just colder this time. But before we wrap up, here's a little oops detail for the trivia lover. When Napoleon invaded Russia, one of his biggest logistical problems was shoes. Seriously, most of his soldiers' boots fell apart in the mud before the snow even hit. In Hitler's case, the same thing happened. The German army's leather soles literally froze and cracked, forcing soldiers to wrap their feet in newspaper. 2 centuries apart, and both superpowers lost to footwear. If that's not poetic justice, I don't know what is. So maybe the moral here isn't just don't invade Russia. Maybe it's don't let your ego write checks that your supply lines can't cash. Because every empire falls the same way, slowly at first, then all at once, then very, very cold. History is full of people who thought they could bend it to their will. But time has a sense of humor. And every now and then it reminds us that even the mightiest plans can end up as cautionary tallies, told centuries later on a YouTube channel with a sarcastic narrator. So next time someone says, "It'll be quick, it'll be easy," what could go wrong? Just remember Napoleon, Hitler, and the Great Russian Winter, silently waiting off stage, sharpening its icicle. Because if there's one constant in the universe, it's this: you can conquer a lot of things, but you can't conquer the cold.